Good morning, or good afternoon, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. Here in Phoenix, it's 10 o'clock in the morning, and time for our second Google Hangout of HST 102. So we're just getting set up and started here. Good questions this week, and something weird with the camera going on here. Just see if I can straighten this out. Let's see. That's very strange. Let's see. I'm not sure how this is looking to you. To me, it's flipping all the time. Let's see how that's going. Maybe if I do this. That get at some of the things we're dealing with in the second half of the course, especially about the transition between a sort of classical world and a medieval world, which in Europe is a Christian world. And that is a fascinating transformation that really is still the sort of events of the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the transition of the Roman Empire from a pagan empire to a Christian empire, and the rise of Islam. Those are in many ways the sort of some of the most momentous events in Western history. And they're from a period where we don't have a lot of great documentation. There's a lot of tradition about some of these things, but it's not a period where we have the wealth of textual evidence that we have, for example, from, say, the 16th century or the 18th century or something like that, or even the period of the transition between the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire at the beginning of the Christian era. So it's interesting that so many changes occur in this sort of early medieval, late classical period, and it's a period where we're still very much living with the consequences of those changes, but we don't, we don't have all the information that we would like to have about them. So today I'll be talking about 4 sort of questions related to this period. The first one is a great question, and it's one that nobody really has an answer for, but we can talk about possible answers. It's the question of why we talked about in Islamic art how there's generally in many forms of Islamic art a prohibition or a disinclination, in any case, to represent human beings and even animals. That figural representation of people and animals is not something that Islamic art focuses on generally. Now, there are lots and lots of exceptions of art from Islamic culture that does this. There are Persian manuscripts of the Shahnameh and things like that that are gorgeous, some of the most beautiful figural art ever produced. Mughal art from India often represents human beings, kings, princes, noblewomen, all sorts of people are represented in these various traditions. But there's a strong tradition at the core of Islamic visual art that focuses on things like floral patterns, calligraphy, and design elements rather than a representation of people and animals. Now, the sort of theological justification for this comes from the 10 Commandments in some form, especially the commandment that says, thou shalt not make any graven image. In terms of the commandments, how was this understood? You shouldn't make a graven image. Well, the primary way that this was interpreted in Judaism and in Christianity and in Islam was you shouldn't worship idols or figures of gods. In other words, God is in some sense, the Abrahamic God, the monotheistic God, is in some way unrepresentable. You cannot draw God. You cannot make a statue of Yahweh. You cannot do this. And this is one of the ways that Judaism and the other Abrahamic religions are very radical, in that if you look at all the other religious traditions that we find in the ancient world, in the Mediterranean and in Europe, they're all focused intensely on representing gods through sculptural means and other visual means. The Roman Empire is full of statues of all sorts of gods and emperors and even of ordinary people to a certain extent. Greece, obviously, in the center of the Parthens in ancient Greece, is the huge statue of Athena by Phidias. The Parthenon is totally covered with representations of people. It's one of the most sacred sites in Athens, but it's full of images of the gods. And in fact, these statues were understood, temples, Greek temples were understood as the home of the god. And you had to have a statue of the god in the temple to show that the god was in their home. And in some forms of Greek and Roman religion, the notion was if there was no temple to a particular god, the god would never visit that place. In other words, if you were praying to Athena in a place where there was no temple to Athena for 100 miles around, Athena wouldn't be very interested in you because she didn't have a home near there, and she wouldn't hear your prayer. She'd be off. She would be much more likely to be visiting her sanctuaries in various places and not listening to you out in a field somewhere praying to her because she didn't live there. That wasn't a place she would be. That's obviously very different from the conception of God in Judaism, in Christianity, or in Islam, where the idea is that God is this omnipotent being that cannot be defined, that sometimes appears as light, that sometimes appears in some sort of human form. We use, if you look at the Bible, there's often human terms used to describe God. You'll hear things like the hand of God or the face of God or something like that. Well, in some sense, those are just metaphors. God isn't imagined, the Hebrew God is not usually imagined as having a hand or having a face in any kind of fundamental way. And you get this in the Adam and Eve story. There's a kind of contradiction in that God appears walking in the garden, and up till that point in the story, God doesn't seem like a being that would be able to walk in a garden, in the sense that God is energy, God is light, God is power, God is love, God is all these abstract things, not a being with feet that goes for a walk. In any case, the philosophical and theological tradition behind the Abrahamic religion says that God is in some ways beyond human representation, and in many ways, of course, beyond human comprehension. We can't really understand God. God is beyond us. Whereas in certain forms of Greek and Roman religion, in any case, the gods are imagined as sort of much more powerful versions of human beings. They have lusts, they have favorites, they have desires, they have bad tempers, they have... they get hungry, they do all the things that human beings do. It's just they're much, much more powerful than any human being could be. However, of course, in Rome, that's not the case. The emperors are declared divine on their death. Some emperors are declared divine a little before their death. There's even a story of one of the Roman emperors, as he's passing away, he's on his deathbed, and his last words are, "Oh, I think I'm becoming a god." So there is a way in Roman religion and in Greek religion and ancient pagan religion to sort of bridge that gap between the human and the divine. A very powerful person could be conceived on some level as entering into the status of godhood. Not the case, of course, in the Abrahamic religions like Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So there's a prohibition in the Ten Commandments for making a graven image. And this can be understood partly as a way of ancient Jewish religion making the rules for itself and saying, no, if you're going to worship, you can't worship a picture of some being, because that's not the real God. God is the real God, and God can't be represented. So if you're worshiping in a temple that has a statue in it, then you're worshiping the image, and that's just wrong. Don't do that. Don't make a picture of God. In some ways, that's clear enough, but there's always a sort of interesting overlap in thought about this around what are you worshiping when you're praying in front of a statue? Are you worshiping the statue? One of the ways that later forms of Christianity look down on this, when Europeans in later centuries travel around the world and find people worshiping, praying in front of statues of their local gods or something in Africa or in other parts of the world, they sort of reduce this to saying that the people think that the piece of wood itself, or the whatever the statue's made of, the piece of stone, that is the god, that the god is the stone and the stone is the god. And very often in religions that worship images, the image is representing the god, but it's not that the image itself is God. In other words, if you took the wooden statue and burned it, that doesn't always mean that you've destroyed God. That could just mean you've done something very disrespectful, very sacrilegious, very blasphemous, et cetera, et cetera. But in any case, there's this distinction that gets set up which on some level is pretty easy to understand, between whether you worship with an image of the god there or not. However, when Christianity comes to become the dominant religion in the Roman Empire under Constantine, they have an enormous task in front of them, one way or another, of converting a society that for centuries has worshipped pagan gods to Christianity. And this is largely successful, and successful in a remarkably short period of time. The transition of sort of general belief of ordinary people in the Roman Empire from a kind of pagan system to a Christian system, the majority shifts within 100 or 200 years, which is interesting to think. But one of the ways that early Christians in Rome encourage this is they say, well, you know, change as little as possible. Change as little as possible. In other words, if people have been praying at a temple of Athena in downtown Rome, why don't we build a church right there in the same place so they don't have to go somewhere else? So that way we can destroy the Athena, the temple to Minerva, as she was called in Rome. We destroy that and build a church there in the place, or maybe just take all the imagery of Minerva out and put in Christian furnishings and set it up as a church, have it consecrated, and now it's a church. That's great. And we know that that's the case. There's a church in the center of Rome, not just around the corner from the Pantheon, called Santa Maria sopra Minerva, Saint Mary above Minerva. In other words, it's a place where there was a temple to Minerva, or Athena, as the Greeks called her, the ancient goddess of wisdom, and it was transformed into a Christian church over time. So this is something that happens. One of the things that is not sort of frowned upon necessarily in these early years of Christianity being a dominant religion at Rome is representing Christ or the saints or other holy people in the space of worship. You see this in the 3rd century in drawings in the catacombs, the Christian burial areas outside of Rome. You see drawings of people in burial areas, drawings of Jesus and so on. You see figures of Jesus or symbols of Christ. And there are symbols too, the cross and the Cairo and various Christian symbols. The fish is an early one. But there are also representations of Christ. And the earliest representations of Christ are sort of interesting from an art historical perspective, because he often looks a lot like Apollo. He's often clean shaven and has sort of curly short hair, as opposed to the image of Christ that we tend to be used to in Western art, which is that he has a beard and sort of shoulder length hair and dark hair as opposed to maybe blonde hair. The idea of Christ as being a clean shaven blonde person with curly hair seems a little odd to us, but in these early representations of Christ in the Roman catacombs and places, that's what we see. So there's a transition in how Christ is represented, but the representation of Christ is fine. And the way that the theologians get around this graven image thing is they say, well, you're not worshiping the picture of Christ. The picture of Christ is just there to remind you that you're in a church. It's just an image of a person who lived. It's not an image of God in the sense that it is not in itself sacred. It is it's just there to help you focus your mind and to give you something to focus your devotion on. But you're not actually worshiping the painting or the statue. You're worshiping God. And you're worshiping God through worshiping one of the 3 forms of God, which is Christ the Son, who was incarnated as a human being. There are not very many representations at this period, at least, of God the Father or of the Holy Spirit. In later Christian art, you get God the Father represented as sort of an old man with a big beard, but there's no point within Christian theology where it's said, you know, the God really looks like an old man with a big beard. That's a visual suggestion of God the Father. He looks like Father. He looks like an old man with a beard, which is what an old, a grandfather would look like. But that's not sort of a definitive representation of what God is or something. It's just, again, to remind you. So that's the theory anyway. But of course, what happens is, especially in the Eastern Church, the role of images of the saints, especially of Mary, mother of Christ, and various other sort of saints and of Christ himself, they become sort of sacred objects, which people carry in processions on feast days, and very often have little shrines in their homes where they can pray, and they would have, you know, a little image of the Virgin that they could pray to focus their devotions or something like this. And this is sort of accepted practice, but there's always that question of what are you doing, or what are you worshiping when you're worshiping this image? Judaism tends to avoid this entirely, and of course, Judaism doesn't have the issue of Jesus, right? There's no Jesus to worship. If you're worshiping God, you're worshiping God. There's no reason to have a picture of Jesus or of Mary or anybody like that. And there tends to not be in synagogues a tradition of having pictures of Moses or whatever. The idea is that within religion, you know, you just worship and you don't need a picture. But Christianity, for whatever reason, and some of it is probably the carryover from the pagan model, accepts that you can have pictures. And in fact, there are gorgeous and very, you know, expensive early works of Christian art made with gold tile and all sorts of things. To, you know, the decorating the church becomes something that is prized and that people spend a lot of money on. Well, in Islam, of course, they inherit the same 10 commandments and the same commandment against graven images. But they also have a couple of other things that Christianity and Judaism don't have. One is there's a tradition that it's not in the Quran, but it's in the Hadith, which is the sayings around Muhammad, that Muhammad spoke out quite strongly against people who made religious figures presumably for other gods. And he said they would be some of the most, you know, some of the most evil people at the day of judgment would be the people judged most evil would be people who made idols and statues of gods. There's also the fact that the Kaaba, the structure in the center of the mosque in Mecca, which is seen by Muslims as the most holy place on earth and the most holy structure on earth, prior to the foundation of Islam, the Kaaba was a religious site, and it was full of, prior to Muhammad taking over in Mecca, the Kaaba was full of idols of various gods. There may have been as many as 360 in there to represent the days of the year. And one of the things that Muhammad did as a foundational moment when he came to power in Mecca was to cleanse the Kaaba of the idols, to cast out all the idols from the Kaaba and make it into a shrine to Allah, the one God, who of course cannot be visually represented, and that's been established in the Old Testament and in various traditions and so on. So there in Islam you have these additional structures saying, you know, don't do this. And one of the things that is unique in Islam is the idea that this carries over into non-religious life, that there is something kind of questionable about representing people visually at all, that you shouldn't do this, that this is not a good thing to do, not just in a religious sense if you're praying, but also, you know, illustrations for a storybook or any kind of public art that isn't religious focused. The idea is that figures of people, and also at certain times of animals, that this is something wrong, that this is not something that is thought of as good. Christianity seldom goes that far. Now, the Eastern Church in Byzantium goes through two periods of what, in the early Middle Ages, goes through two periods of what are called iconoclasm. And some scholars have said they are influenced by the rise of Islam, and Islam is becoming a very popular religion in former Byzantine areas. And one of the things that's seen as pure and clean and good about it is that there are no images to be worshipped. And whether that was an influence or whether it was more internal factors is something scholars debate about. But in any case, there were two periods where the Emperor of Byzantium declared that there should be no use of religious images, that they shouldn't be carried in processions, that you shouldn't pray in front of a picture of the Virgin Mary, that the churches should get rid of them all. And this is fought over because the culture very strongly venerates these things. And so when the word comes that you've got to destroy, you know, the most sacred object in your house, which is probably also one of the most expensive things you own, that doesn't always go over well. Some people say, yes, you're right. And other people are like, no, this is my icon of the Virgin Mary. And it's been in my family, and we're not going to throw it out, and we're not going to stop using it in our devotions. So, but even there, you see in Christianity a movement against. There's a huge debate this is right or wrong. Now, this never goes to deal with non-sacred images in non-sacred contexts. It was very much a concern. The other place you see this trend in Christianity is a little after the end of the period that's covered in our course, and that's the Protestant Reformation, where a lot of early Protestants, John Calvin, for example, say, no, churches shouldn't have pictures of saints. And this is partly because the Protestants are trying to reduce the Catholic practice of praying to saints for intercession. The idea grows up in the Middle Ages that it's more effective to pray to whatever saint oversees the subject of your prayer than it is to pray directly to Jesus or even to Mary in some cases. The idea is that Jesus is too distant a figure in some ways to listen to prayers about, you know, I lost my my goat has run away. What can I pray that I get my goat back? Well, you don't bother Jesus with that. You pray to your patron saint, the saint you've been named after, or you pray to a saint like Saint Anthony that helps find lost things. If you're traveling, you pray to Saint Christopher who protects travelers. In other words, there's all this very rich sort of belief system and structure associated with saints, and the Protestant reformers in the 16th century see this as non-essential Christianity. They see it as folk practice that's grown up after the sort of Christian message as it is described in the Gospels, and so they want to cut down on the worship of saints and on the cult of saints and so on. And as part of this, they want to get images of saints out of churches. And if you see pictures of Dutch churches, for example, from the 17th century, when Holland has become a Protestant country, you will see that, you know, the walls are just bare white, and the windows also are clear. The idea was that stained glass, it looked very pretty, but it was really stopping the pure light of God coming naturally into the church, and you should get rid of that too. This is a whole complex question which goes beyond the bounds of our course, because we stop in 1500 before Luther really breaks with the church. But it shows that even within Christianity, which is a religion that has embraced representation, visual representation of people really from the beginning, there are trends against that and times at which this is seen as inappropriate. So but why Islam goes so strongly in one direction and why Christianity goes strongly in another it's a more complicated. You can't just say, well, here's the answer. But I think these are some of the issues and some of the trends that are seen that have come up. So that's a great question. So we're done with question one. Question two, and this is a question that I often wonder about, though it's absolutely impossible to come up with an answer to it, is what if the fall of the Roman Empire in the West had been a temporary thing? In other words, given that the Western imperial structure collapses in the 5th century, what if the Byzantines managed to reconquer it under Justinian in the 6th century? What if they came back and reestablished Roman rule, Byzantine rule by this point, over Western Europe? What would that have meant for the future? And the short answer to that is we don't know. There's no way to tell what that would have been. It's so different from what actually happened that it's really difficult to imagine. One of the questions is, would it have been better or worse for the future? And that is really impossible to tell for all sorts of reasons. The breakdown of the Western Empire was, in many ways, a real human tragedy, in that it brought in an enormous amount of suffering, that it was, if nothing else, an enormous destruction of wealth, in the sense that the Western Roman Empire was a fairly prosperous, well-connected place with a good economy and a high standard of living and of education, and that absolutely fell apart. And so you have to think that when that happened, many people suffered in ways that they would not have done if the empire had stayed stable and prosperous. This is a complicated question. Now, under Justinian and his general Belisarius, the Byzantines came actually fairly close to taking back some key parts of the Western Empire. They took back North Africa, and they also took back Italy. They reconquered Rome. They established a sort of outpost at Ravenna in northern Italy, where there are still beautiful Byzantine churches that were built there during the period. But then it stopped. And why did it stop? Well, it stopped because of a plague. There was a horrible, horrible plague at the time of Emperor Justinian. And it was as devastating, we're now learning, it was as devastating as the Black Death, the more famous plague in the mid-14th century. The death toll from the Justinianic plague may have been as high as the death toll from the Black Death. And in fact, scholars now think that the Justinianic plague probably was the Black Death, that it was bubonic plague. In other words, this was an earlier outbreak of this devastating disease. The death toll figures are always difficult to get for periods before the modern period, but the standard sort of rule of thumb is about 30% mortality. In other words, 1 in 3 people died. That is absolutely incomprehensible in terms of, you know, what it will be like to live through that or experience that, or what would happen to a society that lost 1 out of every 3 people in a very short space of time, and in just a couple of years. In any case, what happened with the plague in Byzantium under Justinian is it totally took the wind out of their sails as far as conquering anything was concerned. Their armies fell apart, the imperial structure fell apart, the economy fell apart, everything is totally disrupted, and they never are in a position again to win back the West. Part of the problem is that the Byzantines are always in a series of wars with their enemies to the east, the Persians, the Parthians, the empires in what is present-day Iran. They're always fighting on their eastern frontier, and that leaves them very little time to, you know, sort of expand the empire in the West. One of the many factors in the, you know, sort of astonishing rise of Islam is that Muhammad comes to power in Mecca and starts, you know, Islam starts to get off the ground as a social, political, and also a military movement right at the moment where the Byzantines and the Parthians have been in a horrible, horrible war, which has absolutely exhausted their armed forces. So the Byzantines are in no shape to fight back against Muhammad's army, and it's the last thing they expect. Arabia is not on their it's not on their horizon for a sort of an important place where a threat could come from. They're just not thinking about a threat from Arabia because there's never been one before. So they're prepared for a threat from Iran and from the, you know, the empires there, but they're not prepared at all for this new religion that comes out of the desert and is sort of military successful, but is also popular, especially because Byzantium at the time is going through one of its many sort of religious controversies, and there's a feud going on between the citizens of places like Damascus and Cairo and the citizens of Constantinople, which is where the emperor is. And so, you know, that's another factor that helps the places like Damascus and Cairo and Aleppo convert to Islam. They don't feel a particularly strong loyalty to the Byzantine Empire because of this religious controversy, and they don't necessarily all convert to Islam right away, but they're sort of like, well, we're either going to be governed by this Muslim army that just came here, or we're going to be governed by the emperor who we're having a feud with. So what's the difference? Who cares? But the question of reconquest, if the Roman Empire had been able to hold together, well, one of the things, what if it had? Let's just say for a moment that either the empire in the West didn't collapse or the East was able to reconquer. There are a few things to think about. One is that the collapse of the Western Empire is partly due to overstretch. In other words, it's just the question, we're asking the wrong question. We asked the question, why did the empire fall? Whereas the question we're asking is, how on earth did it last as long as it did? One of the issues around this is that, you know, it's an enormous area of land, and the Roman Empire at its height, and it's very diverse in terms of climate and in terms of ethnicity of the population, in terms of language, in terms of all sorts of different things. In other words, there are always going to be a lot of forces sort of pulling it apart. It's already at the point where it's decided de facto that one person is no longer capable of governing the empire. It's too big for one emperor. So you get joint emperors and partner emperors, and at one point there have 4 people being emperors. Once you got 4 emperors, you're on the verge of having a state that's going to be constantly gripped with civil war and have parts splitting off and things like that. So uh, one issue is how well could the thing have kept together in the first place. The other is, would it have been better to keep it all together? And here's, I mean, there's no question, as we said, that the collapse of the empire in the West is enormously disruptive and destructive in a lot of ways. But the kingdoms and systems that come out of that destruction after a few hundred years are the sort of independent areas of Europe that evolve into kingdoms as different as France and the Holy Roman Empire in Germany, city-states in Italy, Spain, England. And what you get there is a lot of cultural diversity, and you also get a lot of cultural competition. You get competition between sort of city-states in Renaissance Italy. You get competition between England and France. This competition is often very destructive and violent, but it's also it also is an enormous spur to creativity, innovation, economic advancement, and all sorts of things. So it's not clear that people advance better in terms of the economy if everything is run by one person. I mean, if everything is unified, then that in some ways can stifle competition. That may lead to things atrophying. It's very hard to sort of make those sort of arguments. What would a unified Roman Empire have done, you know, with the threat of Islam, with the challenge of Islam? What would have happened there? As we see, over half of the Byzantine empire converts almost immediately, and in the long term, quite happily. Would this have happened on a larger scale? About half of the Roman territories become Muslim territories, especially if you include Spain. What is now Spain is Muslim for hundreds of years. It's hard to see that a unified empire would have held on to more of that. It may have been that a unified empire would have encouraged the spread of Islam if it had itself converted, as Constantine converted the whole empire to Christianity. It's hard to say. Interesting questions, though. If you're looking for somewhere to read further, there's a new book that just came out, a man named Kyle Harper, called The Fate of Rome. It deals with the collapse of the empire and a lot of these issues from the perspective of climate change and epidemic disease. There is some reason to believe that climate was changing during the Roman period, and that the way that it was changing was not for the better as far as the empire was concerned. That one of the reasons you start to see things falling apart is that the climate is no longer as fertile. Places are becoming less fertile. We know that this has happened. We know that, for example, in the Greek period, you keep hearing about Sicily as this wonderful place for growing wheat. And if you have Sicily, you have endless supplies of wheat. We know that that's not true today. We know that Sicily is too arid to, farming in Sicily is very hard. And so Sicily is probably more arid than it was 2,000 years ago. Some of these changes are already occurring at the height of the empire, and we're starting to be able to get data now from various sources, tree rings and various other ways that people can look at climate over time. And that's bringing up some issues. The other issue, of course, is epidemic disease. One of the things about the Roman Empire is that it brings an enormous amount of people together in some very small spaces. The city of Rome, for example, ancient Rome had as many as 2 million people in it, all living very, very close together under horribly unsanitary conditions. So it's a dream for a microbe that wants to have an epidemic. I mean, Rome, and Rome is the largest example, but Constantinople is the same, and various other Roman cities on a smaller scale. Basically, when you have an empire and you have this kind of strong connected economy, you start to gather people together in large numbers in small areas, cities, and cities are very prone to disease in ways that more traditional rural areas, more sparsely populated, are not. The other problem you often get in pre-modern times is when you start to produce surplus of food, the population grows, but that leads to overpopulation. And then if the climate goes bad for a few years, or if for some reason there's a fall in agricultural productivity, there's massive death from famine. And this is sort of an endemic problem in a pre-modern world that doesn't have ways of sort of solving problems like famine long term. So just assuming that the empire is a good thing is problematic in itself. And so It's hard to say what would have happened if the empire had managed to hold together. One of the things that Harper points out in The Fate of Rome is that the empire could have collapsed at various points earlier than that and sort of miraculously didn't. So it could well have survived the crisis that led to the fall of the empire, only to have another crisis 100 years later, you know, bring it down anyway. So but it's fascinating to think of these hypotheticals. What if this had happened a different way? Well, the last two questions are related, and they're questions that deal with Christianity and slavery and sort of the ethics around slavery. We were talking about how things change in some ways as the Roman Empire Christianizes in terms of the ethics and the economic practices around slavery. These are complicated questions, and they're hard to sort of resolve. If you're talking about why does slavery thrive at one time and place in history and not at another time, there's a few things to straighten out. One is that slavery, until the last 100 years or so, slavery has been a fairly consistent feature of human civilization. And by slavery here, I simply mean a situation where some people are the property of other people and are not free to own property themselves. In other words, they don't just work for someone and are paid for their work. They are owned by someone as part of their property and may be disposed of as property as opposed to being disposed of as human beings. In other words, you can kill a slave without any penalty because they belong to you. You can sexually abuse a slave without any penalty, again, because they're your property. You can do what you want with what's yours. And they don't have any human rights. In other words, they don't have any more rights than any other piece of property has. You have a right to own them. They don't have any rights themselves. This form of labor, as people have pointed out, is part of civilization in the sense that hunter-gatherer societies don't tend to have this. It's not very effective. It becomes effective when you have large-scale farming and things like that, and a lot of slavery is related to that. There are all sorts of questions as to, you know, is slavery a fundamental feature of an economy, or is it something that builds into it? And this is something we're just learning about, because for a long time it was assumed, as we've seen, that the slaves built the pyramids in Egypt. It seems now that this was done with wage labor. Who knows? These things are complicated. What you do get, I mean, sometimes most ancient societies enslaved people they conquered in battle. They didn't enslave their own people. They enslaved people they conquered in battle. In most places, slavery was not based in any kind of thoroughgoing way in the ancient world on ethnicity as such. In other words, it wasn't the kind of slavery that we're perhaps most familiar with from our own history, of one group of people who look a certain way and come from a certain place being enslaved as a group by another group of people. And the dominant model of this, of course, is African slavery in the Americas, where people from Africa are bought and sold as slaves for hundreds of years, whereas white people cannot be. European people of European descent cannot be enslaved. Africans in many times and places cannot be anything but enslaved. And so there you have something that's entirely built on a sort of racial and ethnic prejudice. That's not the way slavery tended to work in the ancient world. Almost anybody could theoretically be a slave if they were in the wrong circumstances, if their city was captured. If you go back to Homer's Iliad, after the fall of Troy, the surviving Trojans become slaves, of course, because the Greeks capture their city and they take them as slaves. Before they were princesses, but now they're slaves. That's the way war works in that world. Now, what happens to their children? Do they stay slaves? One of the things that we're looking at in the course, and one of the things the question gets at, is when does the notion come that slavery is in itself a bad thing as opposed to just an unpleasant thing? And for the Western world, this I do think is tied with the rise of what I called in the course the ethics around Christianity. And what I mean by that is that Christianity makes claims about the spiritual of human beings that are different than the claims made by pagan religion. One of the things that Christianity says is that all souls are created by God. The soul of a slave child and the soul of a king they're both souls. God created both of them, and that God loves both of those souls and loves them equally. Maybe the king will go to hell and maybe the slave girl will go to heaven. That could happen. that had not been really an issue in pagan religion because of different ideas about the afterlife and this radical notion that in God's eyes, a slave girl might be more valuable than an emperor. That wasn't something that, as a way of thinking, was a characteristic of pagan religion. That just wasn't an idea that came to them. An individual slave might be beloved of a god and might, be, but then the question would always come up: well, if the god loves them, why are they a slave, right? Christianity puts a lot more emphasis on the value of the afterlife. That's one of the things you see in Christianity, because the Greek and Roman afterlife is pretty wretched. Except for certain heroes beloved by the gods or demigods themselves, like Hercules, who get to go to live in the Elysian fields, which is a lovely place where you wander through beautiful meadows. Most of the descriptions we get of the Greek and Roman afterlife are just a sort of shadow where souls wander around without any sort of, they have no substance to their bodies because they're spirits. They have no physical pleasure of any kind. They can't hug each other. They can't touch each other. They often have no memory of their former life because they drink, in certain accounts, they drink from a river of forgetfulness when they get there. So they exist, but just as shadows of their former selves, which is where you get this idea of the ghosts as shades or as spirits in this way. They're insubstantial. They don't have any feelings. They don't have any deep thoughts. They just have a shadow existence, just as a shadow does in the world. They're not people. They're shadows. Christianity changes all that. It says, in fact, the most fundamental part of you is your soul, and that after death, your soul will exist in its full being. It won't be trapped in a mortal body. It will be either blessed or punished, depending on how life was lived. But it's unquestionable for any Christian that the promise of existence in heaven as a sanctified soul after death is way better than life on earth in any manifestation. So what that says is that slaves, in some sense, are not kept out of heaven. And then the question comes up, well, how should you treat your slaves? Now, there are some writers in the pre-Christian classical world, like Stoic writers like Seneca, that say, it's always good to treat people well, and you shouldn't be mean to your slaves. You should treat them like people. You shouldn't wipe your hands on their hair. You shouldn't hit them for no reason. You shouldn't make them stand around all day just because you like to have the slaves standing around while you're eating dinner for 8 hours. You should allow the slaves to sit. You should let them leave the room to go to the bathroom when they have to go to the bathroom. You should treat them with human decency. But Seneca never says you shouldn't have slaves, or that slavery is wrong, or that keeping someone as your property is a bad thing in itself. What he says is you shouldn't be mean to people, even to slaves. That's a different thing. What Christianity says in some form is that slaves are just as good as anybody else, and that leads some Christian thinkers to question the institution of slavery. St. Augustine, who is the most influential of the early Christian theologians, especially in the West, says right out that slavery is sinful, that slavery is a product of human sinfulness, that it should not be. Now, he doesn't say it needs to be immediately abolished, but he does say that it's wrong. There's something fundamentally wrong about it. This goes against classical ethics, which generally Christian thinkers value classical ethics. They go back to the Greeks and Romans to try and find their ethical wisdom, because they think, well, Aristotle was pretty smart. He probably had some pretty good ideas about how people should treat each other. Aristotle says right out that slavery is natural and that some people are just born to be slaves, and that's just the way it is, and so it goes. Some people, they're inferior, they're slaves. That's just what happens. Augustine breaks with that and says, no, so there's an ethical difference. Now, does this mean that Christianity always is against slavery? No, of course. Slavery persists in the ancient world for a long time after Christianity becomes the dominant religion. And of course, if you look over the history of the last few hundred years, Christianity as such had no real problem with the slave trade. Now, various factions within 18th and 19th century society abolitionists were fiercely against slavery on all sorts of grounds, some of them religious, some of them moral, some of them, you know, some of them philosophical, some of them practical, just isn't as good a way of making money. There are all sorts of reasons against slavery. The arguments that they often use were Christian arguments, but the arguments used in defense of slavery by people like Jefferson Davis, the leader of the Confederate States of America, for example, in the Civil War, Jeff Davis just came out and said, no, Christianity's in the slavery's in the Bible. Christianity endorses it. It's natural. It's in the Bible. Go read your Bible. You'll see that it's right for us to have slaves. So Christian scripture gets quoted on both sides of the argument, but one of the things, I guess, the point I was making in the course about Christian ethics is that it brings up the question, because there isn't an argument in the classical world. Nobody in the classical world is saying slavery is not good. Slavery is just there. It's just part of life. There's no reason complaining about it any more than there's a reason complaining about any of the other ways we live our life. Whereas in Christianity, there is a sense, going back at least as far as Augustine, that there's something wrong about this, that people should not be the property of other people. This is partly because of a Christian stress on the importance of free will. Free will in the spiritual sense. In other words, you are not necessarily free to disobey your master if you're a slave, but you're free to choose in your heart to become a Christian. And that's the most important decision you'll ever make from the point of view of Christian theology. And you are free to do this. You are also one of the changes under Christianity is the notion that sex itself is not necessarily a good thing. And one of the most holy ways to live, back to the early days of the church, is to take a vow of chastity. It's better to not, and St. Paul says this in the Bible, it is better to not have sex at all. That sex is part of sinful humanity. And it will be better. We do have to have sex as a species, otherwise we can't perpetuate ourselves. But as an individual, Paul says, it's better to just not. And that was an idea that very few people had come up with in any kind of systematic way under paganism, and never as a kind of principle for the good life of all. The idea that it would just be a good thing to opt out of sexual activity. What this means is that there becomes an ethical reason for a slave to resist having sex with their master. If a slave has taken a vow of chastity, they wouldn't have the power to resist their master. Their master is still their master, but they would be able to say that their master having sex with them was wrong because it was against their vow. Again, that brings up slaves don't have any civil rights or any legal rights. So having spiritual rights is a step forward. I mean, one of the things that often comes as a shock to people is in the pre-Christian world, if you were bringing a slave as a witness in a law case, and this is certainly the case in ancient Greece, you had to torture the slave to get their testimony. Because the idea was, of course, they would lie in favor of their master. So the only way you could make sure a slave was telling the truth was to torture them. And that was just the first thing you did. If you were saying, oh, well, this slave can witness this, you wouldn't just say, well, slave, what did you see? You would, start hurting the slave until the slave screamed what they said. And the idea was, well, okay, we got the truth out of the slave that way. That is clearly, not a system that values the slave on any level, or that sees that the slave has any value. Christianity notionally, spiritually says that slaves' souls have value, and that's a change. As to when Christian ethics sort of became, the dominant ethical system, where and when, as the Roman Empire becomes more Christian, more people start thinking about Christianity in various ways and start thinking of their ethics in terms of Christianity and salvation rather than just pure Aristotelian ethics. Of course, a lot of people don't think about ethics at all. They just do whatever they think is right through tradition or common sense or whatever. But you do start to see, I think, a kind of Christian format, Christian structure for thinking ethically, which is the foundational structure for medieval Europe. And it becomes entrenched in various ways in late antiquity as the Roman Empire makes this transition into becoming a Christian empire. It's not necessarily that Christian ethics on a particular item are any better or worse than pagan ethics, and it's certainly not a case that Christianity always lives up to its ethical teachings. I mean, there's any number of cases where you can show injustice perpetrated under the terms of Christian ethics by Christians against Christians. That's not the issue. The issue is what is thinkable, what is thought, what is generally believed, and what kind of arguments does a certain ethical system allow you to make. Christianity has been used to support slavery just as much as it's been used against it, but it's been used effectively against it at various points in history. And so it gives a sort of framework for the argument. And I hope that sort of clears things up a bit about that complicated topic. If you're interested in the early history of Christianity, this, doing the book thing again, this is a great book. It is The Rise of Western Christendom. And it is by a man named Peter Brown. Very good sort of survey about how did Christianity get its roots, how did it become established as the dominant religion in Rome, and what happened to it after the collapse of the Western Empire when it became the dominant sort of social institution in early medieval Europe. Brown is a great writer and very knowledgeable about these things. If you're looking to explore further, that's a good place to go. The Rise of Western Christendom. Brown also has a really good book on early Christian notions about wealth, which is another area where Christian thinking about money is very different than earlier ways of thinking about money. One of the troublesome passages in the Gospels is that Christ doesn't seem to like money very much, and he doesn't seem to like rich people very much, but the church needed money and rich people. The saying about how it's harder for a rich person to enter heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle was a big stumbling block for the early church because they needed money to have a successful church. You can't run a large religious organization without money. But it seems like the founder of the religion didn't think money was necessary. And this gets into the sort of apocalyptic strain in early Christianity, which is very strong. That is the idea that part of what Christ's coming meant in the first place was that the world wasn't going to be around very much longer, maybe another 10 years. And so if the world is going to be destroyed in 10 years and Christ is going to return and there's going to be the last judgment, maybe money's not that important. But if the world is going to be around for many hundreds of years and you're trying to build a religion and a religious structure and system, you need resources and you need wealthy patrons. And so that's another sort of issue that comes up when you're looking at this sort of fascinating period of the late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. In any case, I hope you're enjoying the course, and I hope you'll enjoy the last weeks as we move into the high and late Middle Ages. And I wish you all the best as we go towards the end of the course. Some students have been asking questions about the design project. The design project, really, it's just entirely open-ended. It's whatever you want to do creatively to respond to the course. It can be a video, it can be a picture or a painting or a sketch or an essay or a poem. It's whatever you want to do in response to the material that you've been presented with in the course. And it's graded on a self-assessment. So it's really just the exercises for you to create something and then think, well, what have I done? And that's I think, a very useful exercise. And so you really are wide open there on what it is that you want to do if you're doing the design project for the course. In any case, we're pretty much out of time, which isn't bad for just 4 questions, and I'll sign off now. And best of luck to everyone for the rest of the semester. Thanks.